The last thing Jed Sanders expected to find in a bar in downtown Los Angeles was someone who made him feel small. He was 6'1", broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that came from 10 years of fieldwork. Cracked knuckles, permanent dirt under the nails, the faint ghost of a scar across the left palm where a Peruvian quarry wall had disagreed with his grip. He'd been in bars in Cusco, where the locals arm wrestled for steaks that would make a Vegas bookie nervous. He'd talked his way out of a detention facility in Ankara, using only a broken watch and a story about his grandmother. He was not, by any reasonable metric, a man who felt small. She walked in at 11:47 p.m. and the room changed temperature. It wasn't the height, though she had that. A full head above most of the men near the door, moving through them the way water moves through stones, not pushing but displacing, as though the crowd understood something about her that took the human brain a half-second to catch up to. It wasn't the leather, which was strange and dark and fitted in a way no tailor on this continent had managed. It was the eyes. They catalogued the room in a single pass, no wasted motion, no social anxiety, no adjustment period. She looked at Jed and he had the sudden, vertiginous certainty that she had already computed him, his weight, his threat level, his value, and filed the results somewhere behind those pale, unreadable irises. He was holding the crystal in his jacket pocket. He'd been holding it since Peru. He really should have left it in Peru. 3 weeks earlier, the dig at Machu Picchu's outer terrace had been going wrong in all the usual ways. The funding was shaky, the site steward was uninterested, and Jed's graduate student, a kid named Marcus who wrote everything in a leather journal and quoted Foucault at breakfast, had fallen into a political argument with the local historical commission that was still, technically, ongoing. The crystal had turned up in a sealed subterranean channel, behind a carved stone face that had no business being at that depth and no precedent in any Incan architectural record Jed had ever studied. He'd held it up to the shaft of morning light that fell through the crack in the channel wall, and the thing had lit up from inside, like a struck match. Not reflected light, generated light. From within the stone itself, something warm and red gold, pulsing slow as a sleeping heartbeat. He'd pocketed it before Marcus could see. He was not proud of this. The money he owed Victor Reyes had something to do with the decision. Victor Reyes, who had bankrolled the Peru expedition in exchange for first rights to any artifact of significant market value. Victor Reyes, who collected things, antiquities, racehorses, leverage, with the detached enthusiasm of a man who had never once in his adult life heard the word no. Jed had been planning to find something, document it, get it assessed quietly, figure out what he was dealing with before Victor's people showed up to appraise and acquire. That plan had lasted approximately 96 hours, which was how long it took Victor's man Garza to show up at Jed's apartment with a very polished briefcase and a very unpolished smile. Then the bar had exploded, not metaphorically, not dramatically. The far wall of Sharky's Bar and Grill had simply ceased to exist in a bloom of heat and noise that took out 4 bar stools, a jukebox, and Garza's extremely expensive suit. In the ringing, smoky silence that followed, Jed had found himself on the floor with his jacket still intact, his pocket still warm, and the woman in black leather standing over him with the same expression she'd had when she walked in, calm, assessing, already past the explosion, and on to whatever came next. "The crystal," she said. Her voice had a layering to it, like 2 notes played at once. "You have it." Jed looked at the burning wall. He looked at the 3 men from Victor's crew, who were no longer moving. He looked at the woman. "Who are you?" he said. "Someone who arrived in time," she said. Marginally. Her name, she told him later, sitting in his car 3 miles from the smoking bar, with the lap scanner she'd somehow already acquired chirping softly on the dash, was Ladera. She said it the way people say names that are new to a language, careful and complete, with all the syllables given equal weight. She had come from a planet called Centrera, which he had not heard of. She had come specifically for the crystal in his pocket, which she called the second eye, and she described it with a reverence that hit him somewhere behind the sternum. The way his professor had described the Elgin marbles on the first day of his undergraduate art history course. Before the politics came in and complicated everything. "Your planet fits safe," she said. She was staring out the windshield at a gas station. "For longer than your civilization has existed. We didn't know it was here. We thought both were lost." "You thought wrong," Jed said. "We often do about Earth." She said it without contempt. That was the thing about her that kept catching him off guard. There was no condescension in it, just observation. A scientist noting variance in results. "Your people hide things in plain sight. You bury them. You mythologize them. We look for technology, and you've wrapped it in legend. Jed thought about the carved stone face in the Peruvian Channel, the way it had watched him with blank, knowing eyes as he pried the crystal loose. Someone knew, he said. Yes. She finally turned from the windshield and looked at him. The gas station light caught her eyes and turned them copper. Someone always knows. That is the only reason you are still here. Kyla arrived in Los Angeles on a Tuesday, which struck Jed as the most mundanely terrible thing about the situation. He arrived the way Ladera had, not by ship, not with any visible technology, but simply by presence, by the sudden alteration of a space's temperature and quality that Jed was already learning to read as the sign that something had changed in the physics of the room. He materialized in the parking structure on Figueroa, where they'd been sheltering overnight, and Ladera was moving before he fully resolved. She was past Jed and hitting Kyla in the upper chest with something that looked like a palm strike, but wasn't, couldn't be, because the impact sent him across the concrete into a support pillar with enough force to crack it. Kyla straightened. He was taller than Ladera. He wore something that might have been armor and might have been a second skin, dark, layered, moving slightly even when he didn't. His face was angular in a way that wasn't wrong but wasn't right either. The proportions slightly off. The jaw too square, the orbital ridges too pronounced. He looked at Ladera with the expression of a man reading a document he's already memorized. And when his eyes moved to Jed, they did something no human expression could quite replicate. A flatness that wasn't disinterest, but something more total. A category below disinterest. A complete absence of the register in which Jed existed as relevant. The Keeper, Kyla said. He had a voice like a subsonic vibration wearing a voice. How quaint that they still use the title. Back up, Jed said. Kyla looked at him, just looked. And then, with the slow, terrible patience of something that had been doing exactly what it wanted for a very long time, he smiled. Ladera hit him again. What followed was not a fight in any sense Jed had vocabulary for. It was a negotiation conducted in kinetics, two bodies moving through a grammar of force that had been evolving since before the pyramids. Ladera was faster, Kyla was more thorough. She would land something that should have ended it, and he would absorb it and reset, like a system running a restore. He hit her once, a backhanded thing that wasn't even aimed, and she went into a parked SUV hard enough to cave the driver's door. Jed ran. He ran because Ladera had told him to, specifically in those words, if Kyla appeared. You will feel the urge to help, she'd said. Suppress it. Your value is the crystal. Your survival is the crystal. If Kyla takes you, he doesn't need me at all. She'd said it without ego, which had made it land harder. Not I can handle him. Just, your job is to live. He ran 4 blocks, then cut into an alley, and pressed himself against a dumpster and breathed. The crystal was warm in his pocket. It was always warm. In Peru, he'd thought it was the climate, the ambient heat of the jungle bleeding through the stone. Here in the Los Angeles night, at 62 degrees Fahrenheit, it was still warm, and sometimes, if he held still enough, he could feel the pulse of it, slow and regular as a sleeping child's heartbeat. He thought about what Ladera had said the night before, when the city had gone quiet enough to talk. They'd been on the roof of a parking structure, a different one, watching the city grid spread out below them in orange and white, and he'd asked her what Kyla would do if he got both crystals. She'd been quiet for a long time. Not evasive, processing. The crystals are not weapons, she'd finally said. They were never weapons, they are a kind of memory. A record of the conditions of life itself, the frequencies that life uses, the way your DNA carries instructions but older, more fundamental. She'd paused. Combined, they become a key to everything alive. A key to what door? She'd looked at him. Every door. He'd thought about that for a while. Around them, the city hummed and breathed, and somewhere to the south, a siren wailed and faded. And Jed had thought about every door opening at once, and what would be waiting on the other side if the person holding the key was Kyla. We're not going to let that happen, he'd said. No, she'd said. And there was something in it. Not relief, not validation, but something else, something like the sound of a word in a language that's almost dead and has just been spoken again by a native tongue. Recognition. We are not. The police found them at dawn. Detectives Carter and Kelly were everything their job descriptions suggested, and not much more. Carter methodical, and perpetually aggrieved. Kelly running on coffee and instinct, both of them operating on the reasonable assumption that the explosion at Sharky's, the 3 hospitalized men from Victor Reyes's crew, and the archaeologist whose apartment had been ransacked, were part of the same story, which was correct, and that the story was about drugs or money or both, which was not. They picked Jed up outside a diner on 7th Street, where he'd gone for coffee and the kind of mechanical calories that came from eating without tasting, and they put him in the back of an unmarked car and drove him to the precinct with the polite, inflexible courtesy of people who have done this enough times that the script runs itself. Jed watched the city pass through the window and thought about Ladera. He didn't know if she was alive. The parking structure had been quiet when he'd finally looped back around. 3 hours after running, the SUV was there. The cracked pillar was there. She was not. Neither was Kyla. The concrete was scorched in a long black arc near the exit ramp, and there was a crater, small, precise, the size of a mixing bowl, in the far wall at approximately chest height for someone Ladera's size. He'd put his hand in the crater and felt the warmth of it and thought, she's still fighting. He'd gone for coffee because you had to do something. The precinct was the usual organized chaos: phones, fluorescent lights, the smell of burned coffee and exhausted people, the sounds of a city processing its own damage. They sat him in an interview room and Carter asked him questions, and Jed answered them with the careful vagueness of a man editing a true story in real time, keeping the shape of events intact while swapping out every detail that would require him to say the word extraterrestrial to a Los Angeles homicide detective. He was midway through an explanation of the Peru expedition when the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a brief interruption. All at once, everything, the overheads, the exit signs, the emergency strips, the glow of monitors through the glass partition, simply stopped. The room went dark as a held breath. Then the door to the interview room opened and Kyla walked in, and the ambient cold that came with him was worse than the dark. He looked different, still large, still wrong in the proportions. But there was something new in his bearing, a completion, an alignment, as though he had resolved some internal question since the parking structure. His left hand was faintly luminous. Not the hand itself but around it, a corona of red gold light that Jed recognized the way you recognize a song from a single note. You don't have to run anymore, Kyla said. Give it to me freely, and I'll let this stand. Let this place, Jed started. The building, Kyla said. The people in it. I'll leave them. Down the hall, someone was shouting. Something heavy fell, then nothing. Jed looked at Kyla's hand, at the light around it. The first eye, he thought, one crystal already. He thought about the sound of the city at night from the roof of the parking structure. He thought about Ladera saying every door. He thought about the warm pulse in his pocket, slow and regular. And he thought about the stone face in the Peruvian Channel, watching him with its blank ancient knowledge. And he thought about the fact that some things get buried, not because they are lost, but because something is waiting for the right person to find them. I can't, Jed said. Kyla looked at him. That flat, total look. Then he raised his hand. The door behind him came off its hinges. Ladera came through the door. She was bleeding, dark and strange, not quite the right color, from a gash across her cheekbone, and one arm of her suit was torn, and she was moving with the slightly too controlled gait of someone managing pain by sheer organizational will. But she was moving. And her eyes, when they found Jed, were sharp and clear and already calculating the distance to Kyla. He's been in the building before you arrived, she said to Kyla. It wasn't directed at Jed. She was talking to her brother's killer, and her voice had gone very still. You thought it would be simple. Find the human. Take the stone. You've never understood why we use keepers at all. Kyla turned to her. The corona around his hand intensified. I've never needed to. Because you don't understand what happens to living things when they carry something like this, she said. She was still advancing, slow and direct, like a tide. You don't feel it, you never have. That's your only limitation, and it's the one that will kill you. You feel too much, Kyla said. It makes you predictable. Yes, she said. It does. She hit him at full speed and they went through the wall. Jed didn't wait. He moved into the hallway, dark except for the light coming from the hole in the interview room wall, and went left, toward the stairwell, toward the sound of chaos and shouting that meant the rest of the building was still populated and still breathing. He found Carter on the stairs, flashlight in hand, weapon drawn, doing the job with the automatic competence of someone whose training had just become the most important thing about them. Sanders, Carter said. The surprise lasted half a second. What the hell is happening? Jed said, very big, and not from here. Not from Carter. He met the detective's eyes. There are people in this building who don't have any part in what's happening. I need them out. I need you to get them out, and I need you to do it in the next 3 minutes, and I need you to trust me on the timeline. Carter stared at him. Then she did the thing that Jed would never stop being grateful for. She took a breath, she made a decision, and she moved. Down the stairs, barking orders, coordinating the evacuation with the clean efficiency of someone who drilled the contingency and wasn't going to let the unprecedented nature of the situation stop her from running the playbook. Jed went back toward the light. Through the hole in the wall, the fight had moved into what had been a records room, and was now a records catastrophe. Shelves down, files everywhere, the smell of something burned. Kyla had Ladera against the far wall, not restraining her, not quite. Holding her in a field of something that Jed could feel in his molars. A vibration that made the air between them shimmer like heat-off asphalt. Ladera was fighting it, every muscle in her face showing the effort, one hand braced flat against the wall, the other reaching. Kyla turned to look at Jed. He was still holding the first eye in his palm, the red-gold corona pulsing now, Kyla said. There was a finality in it, the word of a man who has been patient past the point of patience and is simply stating what comes next. Give it to me now and she survives. That is the last offer. Jed looked at Ladera. She was looking at him. Not desperate, not pleading. She had too much control for that. But her eyes said something very specific, and he'd been listening carefully enough, over the last 3 days, to read it. It was the same thing she'd said on the rooftop, looking out at the city. We are not going to let that happen. He took the crystal out of his pocket. It lit up immediately, the same warm red gold, the same pulse, and it lit up faster than it ever had in his palm, as though responding to proximity to the presence of its twin. Both of them pulsing now, and Kyla's expression shifted for the first time from certainty to anticipation, and he opened his hand to receive it. Jed threw it at Ladera. It was not a good throw. He was not a pitcher. The crystal spun wide and struck the wall above her, and she caught it on the rebound, one-handed, without looking, because she'd already known. She'd known the moment he met her eyes, the moment he said we. She had both crystals for approximately 3 seconds before Kyla reached her. That was enough. The light that came out of her was not an explosion. It was more fundamental than that. The difference between a bomb and a sun. It didn't radiate outward, it resonated. A frequency that Jed felt not in his ears but somewhere older, somewhere below conscious processing, in the same stratum of the self that responds to music and to grief. It found Kyla, and it found the thing in him that was, beneath the armor and the power, and the centuries of unchecked will, the same fundamental biological arrangement as everything else. And it showed that thing to him. Later, Jed would not be able to explain what happened in those 3 seconds except to say that Kyla stopped. He just stopped. Not dead, not destroyed. Stopped, like a clock that's been allowed to wind down, the mechanism intact, the energy dissipated. He stood there in the wreckage of the records room, with his mouth slightly open, and his hands at his sides, and the corona gone, and he looked for the first time like something that could be defeated. Ladera looked at him for a long time. For Centrera, she said, for Tarkin, for all of them. She reached out and touched his forehead with 2 fingers, and Kyla fell. The silence afterward had a texture. Jed stood in it and breathed and listened to the building settle in somewhere, the distance, the first sirens starting up, the city responding to its own disruption the way it always did. Slowly at first, then all at once. Ladera was sitting on a fallen filing cabinet. She was holding both crystals, one in each hand, and watching them. The light in them had settled back to the slow baseline pulse. But they were synchronized now, both beating at the same rate, together, like 2 hearts in a chest. She looked tired in a way she hadn't looked before. Not injured. Tired in the deep molecular way that comes from doing something that takes everything you have. He'll need to be, I don't have the right word in your language, she said. Confined, contained. The frequency damage will take time to reverse, and in that time he won't be a threat, but he cannot simply be left. There are facilities, Jed said, and then thought about what that actually meant. What kind of facility contained what had just been in this room? There are people who deal with unusual circumstances. Unusual. She turned the word over, almost smiled. Yes, I suppose this qualifies. Will it work? Containing him? For now. She looked at Kyla on the floor. For long enough that other arrangements can be made. His fleet will come eventually. There are others who have spent centuries waiting for him to fail. She paused. But not tonight. Not tonight, Jed agreed. He sat down on a toppled shelf and put his head back and stared at the hole in the ceiling where something had gone through it and tried to remember what day it was. Tuesday. Still Tuesday. It felt like he'd lived several weeks inside this one Tuesday. What happens to the crystals, he asked. She didn't answer immediately. He'd learned that about her. The pauses weren't evasion, they were honesty. the time it took to formulate a true answer instead of a convenient one. One goes back, she finally said. The first eye with Kyla, under containment. It is too powerful to leave free, and he used it long enough that it retains some of his resonance. It needs to be isolated. She looked at the crystal in her right hand. The second eye is different. It's been here. It's been held by your people, carried by a keeper, buried in the earth of this planet for longer than your written records reach. It's changed. Changed how? She held it out to him. The crystal sat in her palm between them, warm, pulsing its slow, patient pulse. It knows where it belongs, she said. He took it. It was lighter than it should have been. It was always lighter than it should have been. In the palm of his hand it pulsed once, slow and certain, and the warmth of it moved up his arm like the memory of a held hand. Ladera, he said. You are the keeper, she said. It was never mine to keep. I was only sent to make sure it wasn't taken. She closed his fingers around it with both her hands, held them there for a moment. Your name will be remembered. On my world, on every world that Centrera touched, what you've done tonight will be. It was a bad throw, he said. She looked at him. And then, for the first time since she'd walked into Sharky's bar and rearranged the physics of his life, she laughed. It was a full, unguarded thing surprised out of her, human enough that it closed some distance between them that he hadn't known was there. It was a very bad throw, she agreed. They came out of the building through the back, through a loading bay, that let them out into an alley, that let them out onto a side street, 2 blocks from where the first responders were converging. Carter was there. Of course she was, standing at the mouth of the alley with her jacket over one arm, and her expression doing the thing it did when she was processing, something that fell outside her operating parameters. Everyone's out, she said. 42 people. Some of them have questions. I imagine, Jed said. Carter looked at Ladera. Ladera looked back, calm and complete, and Carter did the same thing she'd done on the stairs. One breath, one decision. The big guy, Carter said. The one in the basement. He needs to be processed. Yes, Ladera said. Carefully. How carefully? Heavily sedated, restrained. Whatever facility you use for the most extreme cases. She looked at Carter directly. I can provide information, technical information. For the containment, I would like the arrangement to be cooperative. Carter stared at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Jed. This is the weirdest Tuesday I've ever had, she said. Yeah, Jed said. Me too. He didn't sleep until Thursday. Not from inability. There was simply too much to do. Too many conversations that needed having. Too many versions of events that needed calibrating. Too many people who had been in a police precinct when the lights went out and needed something to put in the place of what they'd seen that would let them function. Carter handled most of it with a competence that Jed found almost moving. Kelly handled the paperwork, which was apparently enormous. Ladera spent 2 days working with a group of people Carter called in, federal technical, the kind who arrived in black vehicles without markings, and asked questions in the very precise way of people who have file drawers full of questions like these. Jed sat in on some of it. He listened to her explain, in careful English layered with those 2-note harmonics, what Kyla was and what the crystals were, and what the containment required. And he watched the faces of the people listening and saw something he recognized. The moment when the world gets larger, and you either grow with it or you don't. Most of them grew. On Wednesday evening, Ladera found him on the roof of the federal building where they'd been housed and stood next to him and looked out at the city and didn't say anything for a while. The sun was going down in the west, and Los Angeles was doing its thing where the smog turns the sunset into something absurd and beautiful, all saturated orange and deep violet. And the city below was just the city. Traffic lights, the distant mechanical pulse of a place that never quite stops. How long, he asked. He didn't have to specify. When Kyla's fleet comes, she said. Months, perhaps. A year. Possibly longer. They move slowly when they aren't pursuing someone. She paused. And they don't know he failed yet. And when they know, they'll come quickly, to retrieve him or to complete what he started. She looked at the sunset. Neither option is comfortable. No, Jed agreed. He turned the crystal over in his hand. He'd been doing it constantly, the way you work a worry stone, and it had come to feel less like carrying something, and more like being accompanied. Is that going to be your problem? Or mine? She turned to look at him. The sunset caught her sideways, turned her edges gold. It is going to be ours, she said. He thought about this. He thought about the stone face in the Peruvian Channel. Watching with its blank, patient eyes over how many centuries of waiting. He thought about the shape of things that get buried, and the shape of things that get found, and whether the difference between them is time or readiness, or something else entirely, that doesn't have a name in any language currently spoken on Earth. Okay, he said. Okay, she repeated, testing it. The word sat differently in her layered voice, and he heard it land and settle, heard it mean something. He put the crystal in his pocket. The city breathed below them, indifferent and specific and alive. 3.5 million people who had no idea what had happened in a police precinct on a Tuesday night, and who were eating dinner and watching television and putting their children to bed and arguing about small things and laughing about smaller ones. And Jed looked at all of it and felt, in the palm of his hand through the fabric of his jacket, the slow and certain pulse that had been here since before any of them were born. Something keeping time. Something that had been waiting for the right person to hear it. He thought about what Ladera had said the first night, about humans hiding things in plain sight, burying them, mythologizing them. He thought about the Incan stonework, the precise impossibility of it, the carved face that had no precedent and no explanation in any archaeological record. He thought about all the things that humans had built without knowing why, the alignments, the chambers, the sacred geometries that matched no engineering need, but pointed at something, always pointing at something, like hands of a compass made of stone. He thought about his professor's voice on that first morning of undergraduate art history, before the politics came in and complicated everything. These are the things we make when we know something, not when we understand it, when we know it. What else is out there? He asked Ladera. That we've been keeping, without knowing. She looked at him for a long moment. Ask me that in a year, she said, when this is over, and you'll tell me. She turned back to the sunset. Something moved through her face that he'd learned to read as the equivalent of a smile. Subtle, internal, the expression of a thing felt before it's shown. Jed, she said, I'll show you. The sun finished setting. Los Angeles arranged itself into its nightly configuration of light and noise and momentum. And somewhere, in a basement containment cell, a warlord lay still and diminished, and waiting for a fleet that didn't know yet to hurry, and in the pocket of a man who threw badly and ran when he was told to, and asked the right questions at the right time. A crystal pulsed its slow red-gold pulse, keeping the time of something older than any clock on this planet had ever been built to measure. Two people stood on a roof. The city went about its business. The stars came out. Thursday came in gray and low-pressured. The kind of morning Los Angeles gets in late November when it finally remembers it has weather. Jed sat in a federal safe house in Culver City, a nondescript two-story colonial that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee, and read a summary report that the people without markings on their vehicles had put together overnight. It ran to 47 pages. He made it through 11 before the density of bureaucratic caution required him to put it down and stare at the wall for a while. They were calling it a Category 7 extraordinary event. He appreciated the precision. He also appreciated that there was a Category 6, presumably, and a 5, and that somewhere in a filing system he would never access there were 5 whole categories of strange that someone had already seen fit to document. The crystal was on the table in front of him. He'd stopped trying to keep it in his pocket. It was easier to just have it visible, present, accounted for, pulsing its slow and reliable pulse. One of the federal people, a woman named Okafor who had a PhD in materials science, and the expression of someone who had long since made peace with paradigm shifts, had spent 2 hours the night before with a portable spectroscope and a notepad, sitting across from the crystal, the way you sit across from something you want very much to understand, but also very much not to startle. It's not refracting light, she'd said. It's generating it. I can tell you that definitively. What it's using as a fuel source I couldn't begin to. She'd stopped, written something down. Does it respond to you specifically, or just to handling? I think it responds to holding, Jed had said. But it's been responding to me since Peru, so maybe both. Okafor had looked at the crystal for a long moment, and then looked at Jed with the expression of someone who's spent a career studying for one thing, and has just been shown that the one thing is a door. How long were you in Peru? She'd asked. 6 weeks this trip. But I've been working that site on and off for 4 years. Something had shifted in her face. 4 years of proximity. Yeah. She'd closed the notepad. Mr. Sanders, she'd said, I think the crystal was waiting for you specifically. I think that's what keepers are for. He thought about this now, in the gray Thursday morning quiet, watching the light in the crystal, slow, warm, patient. Patient in a way that implied access to time frames that made geological epochs look brief. He thought about the Incan craftsmen who had made the face in the channel, and the craftsmen before them who had chosen the channel, and the people before that who had chosen the site, and so on backward into the deep past until you arrived at whoever had first received the crystal and decided that the most responsible thing to do was to hide it inside the most durable tradition they had, inside stone and legend and the slow accumulating weight of the sacred. Trust it to the earth. Trust it to the people. Wait for the right person to hear it. The door opened and Ladera came in with 2 cups of coffee, which he found both incongruous and somehow exactly right. The third interrogation team finished with Kyla at 0400, she said, setting a cup in front of him. She sat across from him, hands around her own cup, her suit repaired or replaced. He wasn't sure, but the gash on her cheekbone still visible, healing more slowly than he would have expected given everything else about her. He isn't talking, but he isn't attempting to escape, which tells us the frequency damage is holding. Your people's equipment is adequate, actually, better than I expected. We've had practice, Jed said. Yes, I know. She looked at her coffee with an expression he'd come to associate with her processing something complicated. You have considerably more infrastructure for the management of extraordinary events than most planets at your developmental stage. It is unusual. We have a lot of extraordinary events. Yes, she looked up. That is also unusual. He turned his cup in his hands. Is that good or bad? From where you're standing. She thought about it with her characteristic honesty. From where I am standing, she said. It appears to have produced people who are difficult to permanently defeat. Whether that began as adaptation or temperament, I cannot say. She met his eyes. But it is the reason the second eye ended up here. Someone made a choice, Jed said. Someone made a choice, she agreed, a very long time ago, and was, I think, correct. He looked at the crystal between them. She looked at it too. For a moment, they were just 2 people looking at something old, and the apartment was quiet. And outside, the Los Angeles morning was getting on with itself regardless. Tell me about Centrera, he said, what it was like before. She was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, settling, finding the right place to start. Green, she said finally, very green. We had a different star, cooler than yours, more red at the edges of the visible spectrum, so everything that grew was adapted to absorb farther into the red. The forest looked dark, rich. The way your jungle looks, but with more red in the shadow. She stopped. There were birds. I know your birds. These were different. They sang in frequencies you couldn't quite hear. And when you were a child, you could almost hear them. And then you grew and you couldn't anymore. And it was the first loss. She looked at the coffee cup. I used to lie in the forest when I was very young before any of this and listen for the almost sound. I thought if I was patient enough, I'd hear it. Did you? She almost smiled. But I learned patience. He drank his coffee and listened to her describe a world that no longer existed in the same form, that had been burned and occupied and reorganized according to Kyla's economics. And he thought about the difference between the things that can be taken and the things that can't. He thought about memory and what it weighs. He thought about what Ladera carried inside her. Not the crystals, not the mission, but Centrera, the dark forests and the almost sound of birds, intact and safe inside the one container that no fleet could reach. What do your people do? He asked. The ones who survived after. They scatter, she said. They find worlds where they can exist. Some fight, some wait. Some just live, which is its own form of resistance. She looked at him steadily. There is a diaspora. There are communities. There are people who remember Centrera the way you remember a grandparent. Not from experience, but from being told, from inheriting the shape of the loss. They are persistent. That sounds familiar, Jed said. Yes, she said. I thought it might. Outside, a car passed. Someone's radio briefly audible through the window. A snatch of something up-tempo, LA in the morning, not knowing and not needing to know what had happened in a precinct on Figueroa, while the emergency generators ran and Carter evacuated 42 people down a stairwell in the dark. The fleet, Jed said. Yes, tell me what we're looking at, honestly. Not the version you gave the people in the black cars. She set down her cup. 3 vessels, possibly 4. Kyla was operating alone because the recovery of the crystals was meant to be straightforward. A planet at your stage of development, no significant resistance anticipated. The fleet is a garrison, not a war fleet. They are capable of significant damage, but they are not equipped for a sustained campaign against a defended world. She paused. The key word is defended, and are we? Defended, not yet, she said. But you are. She searched for the word adaptable, remarkably adaptable. In ways that tend to surprise people who study your planet and believe they have accounted for all the variables. She looked at the crystal. I have some ideas. I'd like to hear them. I know. She picked up her coffee again. That is why I'm telling you. The week that followed was, by any measure, the strangest of Jed's life, which was already a life that had included several contenders for the title. Ladera worked with Okafor and a rotating cast of specialists, physicists, linguists, engineers from a program that didn't have a public name, in a converted conference room in the federal building, and what they produced together was less a weapons program than a kind of translation project. The crystal emitted a frequency. Kyla's armor had operated on a related frequency, boosted and weaponized but related. If you could read the base frequency, you could, in principle, counter the derived one. Okafor worked 8-hour days and slept on a cot in the corner, and ordered takeout from a Thai place 2 blocks away with the systematic devotion of someone who has decided that caffeine and pad CU are the appropriate fuel for paradigm collapse. Carter came by on day 3 with a cardboard box Jed's things from his apartment, which had been processed, searched, and returned to something approaching its original state by people who were very good at making things look untouched. Your wallet was in Peru, she said, setting the box down. Apparently. I know, Jed said. Peruvian currency. We made drug jokes. I heard. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table. She had the look she'd had on the stairs. Processing, deciding, committing. I've read the summary report. All 47 pages. Good. The part about the fleet, she said. Yeah. The part where it says months, possibly a year. She tapped the table once, twice. Sanders, I have 42 witnesses who don't know what they saw. I have a basement containment situation that my supervisors are calling a Category 7 extraordinary event. I have a materials scientist who hasn't slept since Tuesday and keeps sending me equations at 2 in the morning. She looked at him. What I don't have is a plan. Ladera has some ideas, he said. Ideas like the ones that took out the records room, or ideas like the ones that ended whatever that was on the basement level. The second kind, I think. Carter nodded slowly. I need to be read in fully, not the summary, everything. I know, Jed said. I'll talk to her. Carter stood up. At the door she paused, one hand on the frame, and looked back. What's worth, she said. The throw. I pulled the security footage from the precinct camera that somehow survived. She had the expression of someone managing a smile by main force. It was really bad. Yes, Jed said. It was. It worked, she said, and left. He sat in the kitchen for a while after that, with the crystal on the table and the sounds of the house around him. The distant conference room hum of Ladera and Okafor and their rotating specialists. The occasional car outside, the particular quality of daytime, quiet in a building full of people doing focused work. He thought about Ladera lying in a dark alien forest as a child, listening for the almost sound of birds she couldn't quite hear. He thought about patience as the first lesson. He thought about what she'd said. You have considerably more infrastructure for the management of extraordinary events than most planets at your developmental stage. He thought about all the things they'd built without knowing why. He put his hand on the crystal. It pulsed once, slow and warm, and the warmth ran up his arm and settled in his chest next to something he recognized as purpose. Not the small personal kind that gets you out of bed, but the larger inherited kind. The kind that runs in bloodlines and traditions and the accumulated choices of everyone who came before you, and decided, against all reasonable odds, to leave something behind for whoever came next. Someone had put this crystal in the ground and waited for the right person to find it. Jed Sanders had found it on a Tuesday in Peru and tried to hide it in his jacket pocket like a man who owed money to a gangster, which was not, by any definition he could construct, the mythological origin story of a keeper. But here he was anyway. He picked up the crystal and carried it into the conference room where Ladera was drawing something on a whiteboard in 3 languages, one of which was not from this planet. And Okafor was staring at it with the expression of someone reading a proof that keeps being right. Show me, he said. Ladera turned from the whiteboard, looked at him with those cataloging eyes, weight, threat level, value, something else now that hadn't been there before. From the beginning, she asked. From the beginning, he said. She picked up the marker and started. Outside, Los Angeles went about its Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday business. 3.5 million people, not knowing what was coming, and not needing to yet, because there were people in a converted conference room in Culver City who were going to spend the next year making sure that when it came, it didn't come as a surprise. A crystal sat in the palm of a man who threw badly. It pulsed its slow red-gold pulse, patient as stone, warm as a held hand, keeping time, waiting for whatever came next.